On May 6, 2026, at the Airbus Canada Assembly Facility in Mirabel, Quebec, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood on a factory floor and announced what his government described as the largest order for a Canadian-designed and produced aircraft in history. Airbus and Malaysia's AirAsia signed an agreement for 150 Airbus A220-300 aircraft, valued at approximately $19 billion at list prices. That is not a routine procurement announcement. By any measure, this is a significant industrial event, and today I want to walk through what the deal actually involves, what it means for Quebec, why the political dimension is impossible to ignore, and where the real questions sit beneath all the celebration. Let me start with the basics. All 150 aircraft will be assembled at the Mirabel facility north of Montreal, which is the main production site for the A220 program and the only location outside Europe where Airbus operates a major commercial aircraft assembly line. The facility currently employs over 4,600 workers, and Airbus supports more than 27,000 Canadian careers across its broader supply chain, drawing on over 850 Canadian suppliers. This order, in other words, does not just affect one factory. It reaches into machine shops, component manufacturers, and engineering firms across the province and beyond. The signing ceremony itself was a notable political moment. Carney was joined on stage by Quebec Premier Christine Frechette, and the event drew union leaders and local politicians as well. The Prime Minister framed the agreement as proof that Canada's trade diversification strategy is producing real results, pointing specifically to his October 2025 visit to Kuala Lumpur, where he met with AirAsia's leadership during the ASEAN summit. That connection between a diplomatic trip and a factory floor announcement is exactly the kind of narrative a government wants to be telling, and Carney leaned into it directly.
Here's where things become more complex, because the scale of the order also pushed a program milestone that carries its own significance. This deal pushed the A220's total firm order book past 1,000 aircraft, a threshold the industry had been watching. An aviation analyst quoted in reporting around the announcement described the order as putting the A220 program on a path toward profitability, while Airbus Canada's own CEO acknowledged the program is still, in his words, a few miles away from breaking even. Those two statements are not contradictory, but they do paint a more nuanced picture than the celebration in Mirabel suggested.
To understand why this announcement landed the way it did, you need to understand Quebec's relationship with the A220 program, because it is not a straightforward one. The province currently owns a 25% stake in Airbus Canada, a position it acquired through a sequence of investments that began when the aircraft was still called the Bombardier C Series. Quebec stepped in financially to help Bombardier avoid collapse, and when Airbus eventually took control of the program, Quebec retained its equity share. The problem is that the financial returns on that investment have been deeply disappointing. The province has written off its initial $1 billion U.S. investment as essentially worthless, and last fall it reduced by half the estimated value of its remaining stake, pegging it at approximately $300 million U.S. dollars. So Quebec is simultaneously a proud co-owner of a world-class aerospace program and a government that has absorbed significant financial losses on that same program. Against that backdrop, an order of this size matters enormously to the province's political calculus. A backlog of 150 aircraft, with options for 150 more, means the Mirabel line has guaranteed work stretching well into the 2030s. That translates into employment stability for assemblers, structures mechanics, electrical fitters, and quality inspectors. And it gives the broader Quebec supplier network a planning horizon it has not had in years. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union, which represents workers at the Mirabel facility, called the deal good news amid ongoing economic uncertainty, which is a measured but meaningful endorsement from labor. This adds an important layer to the story, because the timing of this announcement also fits within a broader federal strategy that Carney has been building since taking office. His government has repeatedly framed Canada's economic response to U.S. tariff pressure and shifting global trade relationships around the idea of reindustrialization and diversification. Signing a nearly $19 billion deal with a Southeast Asian airline assembled in a Canadian province is a tangible data point for that argument. It is easier to make the case that your trade diversification agenda is working when you can point to a specific factory, a specific order number, and a specific set of jobs. What stands out here is that the political benefits of this announcement fall almost entirely in Quebec. Frechette's presence at the event was not incidental. She is the premier of a province that has watched its flagship aerospace investment lose paper value for years. And a deal that secures employment and production volume at Mirabel is something she can take back to her constituents with a clear message. For Carney, whose Liberals need Quebec seats to maintain their position, the optics of standing inside a busy aerospace plant alongside a provincial premier represent exactly the kind of governing moment the party wants to project. Here is where I think it is worth slowing down, because any honest assessment of this deal has to engage with the operational context surrounding the A220 program right now. And that context is more complicated than the announcement suggested. The aircraft itself is well regarded by airlines that operate it. It carries between 100 and 160 passengers, offers strong fuel efficiency, and has a range of up to 3,600 nautical miles. Air Canada has ordered it multiple times and praised its economics. AirAsia is not buying 150 planes without doing serious analysis of whether the aircraft suits its network. That part of the story is straightforward. The harder question is whether Airbus Canada can actually deliver these aircraft on the timeline the deal implies. First deliveries are scheduled for the first quarter of 2028, and Airbus has set a target of producing 13 A220s per month by that point. But Airbus entered 2026 already under pressure. In its first quarter results, the company reported that commercial aircraft deliveries fell 16% year over year, with profits in that division dropping sharply. The primary reason cited was an ongoing shortage of Pratt & Whitney engines, which affects multiple Airbus programs simultaneously. Negotiations between Airbus and Pratt & Whitney over engine supply volumes had shown no meaningful progress as of February 2026, according to publicly available reporting. The A220 uses Pratt & Whitney's PW1500G geared turbofan engine, and at various points in the recent past, roughly a fifth of the global A220 fleet has been grounded because of inspection requirements tied to those same engines. This raises a key question. If Airbus is already struggling to maintain current delivery rates because of engine supply constraints, how realistic is it to promise 150 additional aircraft starting in early 2028? Airbus's own CEO has said the company is producing to plan, but the plan itself has been revised downward. The original A220 production target for 2026 was 14 aircraft per month. That was later reduced to 12. The target of 13 per month by 2028 is now the stated goal, but it assumes the engine supply situation resolves, which is not guaranteed. An aviation management professor at McGill University put it plainly in coverage of the May 6 announcement, saying the jury is still out on whether the A220 can be produced at a rate that is profitable for the manufacturers. That is an important counterweight to the celebratory framing. It does not mean the deal is not real or that the jobs are not coming. It means that the distance between signing an agreement and actually delivering 150 planes on a profitable schedule is significant. And that distance involves supply chain variables that neither Airbus nor the Canadian government fully controls. The federal government is right to celebrate the order as a commercial achievement. But it would be worth watching how the production ramp actually unfolds over the next 18 months. Let me pull back to the bigger picture, because I think this deal is worth understanding not just as an aviation story, but as a signal about how Canada is trying to position itself economically in a period of genuine disruption. The backdrop here is real. U.S. tariffs have created significant pressure on Canadian exports. Trade relationships that seemed stable for decades are now being renegotiated or abandoned. The Carney government came into office promising to diversify away from an over-reliance on the American market. And that is not a trivial goal, given how deeply integrated the two economies are. Every major deal with a non-U.S. partner, whether in Asia, Europe, or elsewhere, is a proof point for that strategy or an attempt at one. The Air Asia order fits that frame almost perfectly. It involves a Malaysian airline, assembled in Canada, sold partly on the strength of diplomatic groundwork laid during an ASEAN summit visit. It is a deal that runs through Southeast Asia rather than through Washington. And it arrives at a moment when Carney needs visible wins on the economic file, particularly in Quebec, where the federal government's support is electorally significant. The political geometry here is not subtle, and there is nothing wrong with acknowledging that a good policy outcome and a good political moment can coincide. But there's another detail worth noting, which is the longer-term question of what this deal actually changes for Canada's aerospace sector versus what it confirms. The Mirabel facility was already operating. The A220 program already had a substantial order book. What this deal does is extend the production horizon, secure employment stability for several more years, and add a high-profile customer from a strategically significant region. Those are meaningful outcomes. They are not, however, a structural transformation of Canada's aerospace industry. The challenges around program profitability, engine supply, and production costs were present before May 6, and they remain present after it. The more interesting question going forward may be whether Quebec and the federal government use the momentum from this announcement to address some of those structural issues. The province has a 25% stake in a program that has not yet returned value on their investment. The federal government has framed aerospace as a strategic industrial pillar. If both levels of government are serious about that framing, the question is whether they move beyond celebrating individual orders and start addressing the longer-term conditions that would make the A220 program genuinely profitable and resilient. That includes supply chain investment, workforce development, and a frank conversation about what it costs to maintain a world-class aircraft manufacturing presence in Canada over the next decade. The order gives the sector a longer runway. What the sector does with that runway is still an open question. Where do you think this goes from here?